Hey everybody, welcome back to Cloud Compass Podcast. It's been a while since I've recorded, but I am so inspired and excited today. We've been trying for over a couple months now to get together. I have the guest here that you're going to want to listen up to. Her name is Janae Marie Kroc. She is a owner of a Crocs gym in Novi, Michigan. She is a former Marine of working for the president. She has been a powerlifting world champion, and I will let her introduce more of her story. But Janae is here with me to talk about the costs and benefits of authenticity that we all face in some way, shape, or form. So, Janae, introduce yourself. I am so excited you're here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I mean, I was in the Marine Corps right after high school. I was recruited into presidential security, spent 4 years in the Marines and worked under President Clinton, did security for admirals and generals that worked at the Pentagon. We did security for United Nations conferences and some of the other things. After that, I went to college, got married, had 3 sons, and also became a pharmacist. Did that for 17 years. And during that time, I also became a powerlifting world champion and world record holder. And then I moved on to bodybuilding after that and won state championships and competed at a national level in that as well. And I currently compete in Jiu-Jitsu. And I've won 2 age group and belt level world championships, and hopefully be winning my 3rd here in another week. I compete next week at Worlds in Vegas.
So
Um, yeah.
your body has been the topic of your life in many
Yeah.
ways, shape, and forms in terms of how you've utilized it.
Mhm.
I will also mention there's a documentary about Janae called Transformer. And would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the documentary was filmed from 2015 to 2017, and it mainly follows what happened in my life after I was outed publicly. So I was already out to like family and friends and those people close to me, and I was out to some of my sponsors. So at this time, this is like the peak of my powerlifting career, or what towards the end of my career, but I was still very popular and competing, and I
Competing
was on the.
as, and at this
Oh
point
yeah,
in
I
the
guess.
podcast, we did not mention this yet. You were
Yeah,
competing as
yeah,
your
yeah.
name
So I
at the time.
Yeah, so I've always competed against men,
Okay.
and that's one thing people wonder right away. When they hear transgender and athlete, they assume that I'm competing against women. I've never competed against women, and I continue not to. I compete in the men's division in jiu-jitsu, and all of the competitions I've won and stuff have been against males. And we can talk more later about why I've decided to do that and why I feel that's
Yeah.
appropriate for me, and about trans athletes in general. But yeah, that's especially currently with the current culture, I think that's an important thing to
Yeah.
clarify.
Absolutely. So
But yeah.
so you were living for most of your life in a male presence
Yeah.
in life. And that's how you developed all of the bodybuilding and the powerlifting and all of that. And people knew you as that persona.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, 100%. That was a huge part of my identity. I mean, it was my identity, and that's the thing. Like, so, I guess to kind of go to the beginning and explain to people, they're like, well, if you're trans and you're a woman, then why did you pursue all these things that are quote unquote so manly? Well,
Yeah.
first of all, I would say that's a very nebulous thing, like to define what is masculine, what is feminine. I think you can point to anything in life that you consider, let's say what society considers very masculine, things like the Marines, I'm into drag racing old muscle cars, powerlifting, bodybuilding. But in all these endeavors, there are women that enjoy these things too, and that are very
Yeah.
passionate about it. So, um, yeah, to say that those are exclusively masculine things, I don't think that's true. I think we can say maybe on average, men tend to have a greater interest in them, but at the same time, we're conditioned from the time we're born into different roles for both genders. I mean, we treat, babies differently, different outfits, different colors, different hairstyles, different, everything, right from a very young age. Little girls are, taught to be pretty and delicate and kind and
And
a little
quiet.
bit and quiet. Yes. And that's, yeah, very problematic. And then little boys are taught to be bold and tough. And, you get two kids playing on the playground, the little girl falls down and, people are running over there. Oh my God, honey, are you okay? And then the little boy, same thing happens. And if he starts to cry, stop crying, be tough.
Toughen up. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like we never have a chance to just be ourselves. We learn from a very young age what's expected of us and what's acceptable behavior and what's not. Um, so while I do think there are, some genetic differences on average, I think they're a lot less than, what we see in society because we are so conditioned from birth basically to, into these gender roles. And that's why I find it very interesting now that there's this lot of this propaganda and this narrative being pushed that trans people are somehow being coerced into this or being forced to be trans. And it's really ridiculous because it's still something that is not received well. Like, and there may be some places where maybe the cool kids at school are trans. I have yet to see any, but
Right.
I've
They're not
heard,
yeah. It's not usually
but
the popular person. I'm
yeah.
curious, I'm curious in the body that you have been in this life,
Mhm.
powerlifting and the bodybuilding and all of the sort of performances you've chosen.
Mhm.
What about the powerlifting and the body using your body in a skillful way? What is that for you?
So for me, it's just that was just something from a very young age I was always drawn to and always passionate about. And that's what it made being trans very confusing for me because of course I'm being told the whole time these are very masculine pursuits and this is a manly thing. In one way, it was a place of safety for me because it was how I was able to integrate into society and where I was basically able to hide but be comfortable and still be myself. I mean, as an athlete, I've always been obsessed with athletics. I've always loved to train. I mean, I was the kid in third grade that was, and I don't know if you did, I know a lot of people did. We had a track and field day at the end of the year.
I
And
hated
for me,
mine.
yeah, see, mine, that was my favorite day of the year. Like I literally looked forward to it all year. And to me, it was like my own mini Olympics. And I
Oh,
trained for months for that. And it was the most important thing to me. And I played, growing up, I played sports year round. And that's just, I loved all those things. And I was just always drawn to weightlifting. Like anytime I would see someone big and muscular, I was in awe and I was like, wow, that's how I want to be. But then I also had all these feelings of feeling like I was supposed to be female. And like we were talking off air before we started, it was, you know, very confusing for me because there was no internet, there was no information. I didn't even know what a trans person was. I
right.
just knew like by the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I was daydreaming about being female. And for people that wonder, because sometimes you have this narrative where something happened that caused that, right? Oh, something happened to you as a child. No, I grew up in an extremely masculine environment. Um, I was the oldest of three boys. My dad was very masculine. My mom was very much a tomboy. My mom, wore blue jeans and t-shirts, no makeup, and she was kind of very rough and tumble. Like her sisters love to tell stories about her beating girls up at school and getting into fights and stuff. So there was like literally no classic femininity. I had no female friends.
Yeah.
Like I was
There
immersed in a world of masculinity, and
wasn't a lot of frame of reference for these daydreams,
yeah,
yet you still had them.
yeah. Yeah, and the funny thing was, it was like when I would, be daydreaming or whatever and picturing myself being a little girl, I didn't picture myself playing with dolls and doing things like that. I mean, there were certain things that I was always into. Like as I got older and got into my teens, I was very interested. I just found a natural attraction to things like makeup and purses and fashion, but I never ever pursued any of that because I was so
Mm.
terrified. But it was a tough way to grow up because people don't realize like how much it permeates your life. I could not go into a department store without having tons of anxiety because I wanted nothing more than to go look at the makeup, to look at the purses, to look at the high heeled shoes. And I couldn't. I couldn't ask for that. I couldn't do that. I knew that like the repercussions would be very, very bad. I grew up in a small rural town in northern Michigan. and which we were taught from a young age that like what men are supposed to be, and that involved being super, very, very tough, getting into fights and doing things like that, and just being this like the 80s idea of a man, the Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Commando, the Rambo, those things, and that was what gave you value as a person. And I was taught growing up that there was nothing worse that a man could do than be gay. And I was always more attracted to girls, but I knew, like, I thought, well, if being gay is that bad, whatever I am must be worse. And
Yeah.
I had a lot of self-esteem issues, a lot of I felt a lot of guilt and shame. I was raised Catholic, and so I thought not only did how did I feel was, you know, weird or different, but that it was wrong and somehow sinful. And I would pray all the time to not feel that way. Of course, that
Mm.
did nothing. But I lived in constant fear of somehow being exposed. Somehow, my parents or my siblings or someone would find out. Like things like I stopped going like trick or treating when I was 10 because every year it was like torture for me. Every year I wanted to be a princess or, just dress up in some type of little girl costume, but I knew I couldn't ask my parents for that. If I even brought that up, like every year, I would hope that my mom would be like, well, let's just dress you up like a little girl this year. And, and I remember one Halloween, she was talking about doing it to my little brother, and I was like so
The
upset
wrong
about that.
kid.
And yeah, and because I wanted it to be me, but I couldn't even say, and she didn't end up doing that anyway, but I wanted it so bad, but I knew like I can't say, well, mom, how about I'll be a little girl this year? And I know the immediate question would be, well, why would you want to do that? Like, and I was just perceived to be this like, little like because I was such an athlete and I was, immediately like attracted to, lifting and all those things. I started, lifting weights at 9 years old. And by the time I was 12, like I haven't had more than a week or two off training since I was 12 years old. It was just something I was always into.
I
When I
read
was
it
six,
somewhere where you use milk jugs and stuff.
yeah, so yeah, initially, yeah, we like I said, we were pretty poor. I grew up in a trailer out in the woods, and I found a bent bar in the woods, and I filled up milk jugs with sand, and I made a bench out of a 2x12 and a couple cinder blocks. And I every year for Christmas, I begged my parents for a weight bench and weight set. And then when I was in fourth grade, they got me a set of dumbbells. And then I used those like, consistently year round. I remember I made charts that I hung up on the wall in my bedroom that I filled in like sets and reps and weight. And then the following year they got me my first weight set in fifth grade. And but that was just something I was always into. But like I said, that was my safe place. That's where I could hide because that was considered not only normal but very acceptable, for a little boy to do. And I was good at it. I was super competitive. I mean, how many kids in third grade when they're 8 years old are training for track and field day?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so I was just the kid that was obsessed with all these things, and I was a decent athlete. Um, I was super competitive and focused on those things and always pushed myself really hard. And so being good at sports, that's what gave me self-worth and value. But the tricky part was when I, finally as an adult started to deal with my feelings and realized like I can't go on any longer hiding this stuff, that like trying to make sense of, my passion for lifting and athletics, because I was what was offered initially, and unfortunately by the first therapist I saw, um, and by society at large, was that these were manly pursuits. And the first therapist I saw presented the idea that, well, I'm doing these things to hide who I am and to compensate and all these other things. Well, and for some people, that's definitely true. There are definitely some trans girls that did do that, like trying so hard to hide everything that you're going the opposite way. And I did do that in some ways, but it was more like with behavior and things like that. And I was like extremely uncomfortable wearing anything that was feminine at all, like if it because it made me feel exposed. Even though I really wanted to, it made me feel really exposed. And there were times like there was one time a girl on the school bus goofing around sprayed me with her perfume, and I got really upset about it. And I remember her face being shocked that I was so angry. And but what she didn't understand and no one else understood was that made me feel super exposed. And even because I actually liked it, but I couldn't admit that. So it
I'm
caused a
gonna
lot of like anger.
I want to thank you so much for sharing that, because I want to pause right there and just
Mm.
acknowledge that in my experience with cis hetero males, that fear, not the fear of, being exposed as a woman, but the fear of being exposed as anything other than the
Mhm.
masculine box that they've been put in is what is actually fueling a lot of the anger that I see in my cis hetero men. Like, to be sprayed with perfume.
Yeah.
No, I'm not. I, I can't expose that part of myself. I can't expose that I like a play. I can't expose that, like, and
Mhm.
I am not going to mention who, but I have somebody very close to me who I am so grateful that they share all of themselves with me, that they don't feel comfortable sharing with others. It's that is toxic. The fact that
Mhm.
a little boy has to be so afraid of being sprayed, a little boy at the time has to be so afraid of being sprayed with perfume. For who? For
Yeah.
who? Who's benefiting
Yeah.
from that?
Why does anyone care? And I think it has gotten a lot better. Like those things are less of an issue than they were in my generation, but it's still, it's anything, it's super threatening to any of the boys or men to have anything question their masculinity. And,
Yes.
and it's often even done by women. It could be their mother, their partner. It's like, and that's a thing that's really difficult too, because now like men will be told like it's okay to be more emotional, it's okay to show that, but then when they do, they're reprimanded or
Yeah.
humiliated for it.
Yep.
I'll hear women say sometimes, yeah, my husband cried and it was such a turn off, and I told him I don't ever want to see that again. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that poor guy.
Yeah, exactly.
And then so what do? And I have a lot of close male friends, and if that stuff happens, you think they're ever going to open up again? No, they're not going
Exactly.
to allow themselves to be vulnerable, and they know they can't. And that's one of the reasons why substance abuse is so high in the male population, because they
Thank
don't
you
feel
for
they have
bringing that up.
another alternative. Yeah.
100%. I agree with you
Mhm.
wholeheartedly. Oh, that is such an important point. When somebody cannot be their full self, there is a cost to it. So I want to bring this back to your story, because you, again, you're living in this male presence. You're, you got the wife, you got the kids, you've got all these titles. And how were you feeling inside of this
Yeah.
so great of a life?
So here's the thing. So like, and don't get me wrong, like I love competing, always have, and probably always will. And that's why I'm still doing it. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I liked the competing. I liked the progress. I liked the work. I thrived on competition, and I really enjoyed all of those things. But the more I accomplished, the harder it became to come out and be myself. It was like I was being built up on this pedestal, and like I felt like, I was being, like my relatives and friends and everybody were like, oh, Croc is the person who can do anything. And I was seen as this, and the ironic part is I was seen as this, not only, this really good male athlete, like uber masculine, like I was seen as, people would say, oh, like you're like this ultimate alpha male. And, I was the
Yeah.
former Marine. And like, even, and that's what people don't get, like the people in boot camp, when I was in boot camp, so in the Marine Corps, and I don't know if this still goes on because it's been, well, 91 is when I went to boot camp, but it was not uncommon for the drill instructor to pick what they would call kind of an enforcer. And this was like a very unofficial thing. They didn't tell you this, and they didn't, but I was pulled aside, and we'd have some conversations with my senior drill instructor, but basically, you know, in a roundabout way, he'd let me know that it was my job to keep the other recruits in line. And if there was a recruit who was underperforming or, messing up a lot, what they would do is when we would do hand-to-hand combat or these other type things, I would be paired up against this person. And my job was to beat the heck out of them and get them, back in line, which it was difficult too. But yeah, not only like was I in a world that was, seen as super masculine, like I was seen as the most masculine, like the most aggressive, the toughest, in that group. And the same thing in powerlifting. Like I was known as the most intense, the craziest person. My workouts were viewed as like, some of the hardest. And I did, and that was just part of me being super competitive and trying to work really hard. But I built this reputation of being this uber masculine alpha male type. And one of my sponsors that I came out to early on that I got close to was Dave Tate of Elite FTS, and he was super supportive and very cool about it.
Mm.
And I just recognized, like, after being there for a couple of years, that like I got pretty close to him, and I kind of feeled him out a little bit, but I felt like he was someone I could come out to, and I wanted to. And it was a big risk. I mean, he could have fired me and gotten rid of me and stuff, but my instincts were correct, and he was super cool and supportive. So for years, he thought it was hilarious that all these people that were super homophobic and transphobic were huge fans of mine. And when eventually when I did get outed publicly, like, I got all kinds of messages about people burning the posters I had signed for them, and all this stuff, and which was very crazy, like. But yeah, not only did I exist in a masculine space, I was at like the, you know, 99th percentile for the people that were in that space. And then the whole time I'm harboring all these feelings inside. And the more success I had, and the better my career got, was the harder it became. It felt like I had so far to fall, right? Like the higher up I climbed, I knew, like, whenever. And the thing is, I wanted to be out. Like, it's not natural for me. I'm not a type of person who holds stuff in, and I'm very open about things, and I prefer to be that way. But this was out of sheer fear and terror. And I did tell, like, for people that are wondering, with like my marriages and stuff, um, as an adult, I was honest with every single girl I ever dated up front. I either told them before we started dating or on our first
Wow.
date. And I just didn't think it was fair to them. I didn't think it was fair to me. And I didn't want to be in a relationship where, especially after um, I got divorced, that I didn't want to be with someone who that was going to be a big issue. Because my first wife, she was the first person I ever told. And that's when I was 23. And it was right after I got in the Marines. And actually, she kind of guessed. She knew there was something different about me, but wasn't sure what it was. And we were friends and hanging out before we started dating, and she just kept guessing at things, and it took her a while, but she finally, one night, she guessed it, and I couldn't really bring myself to fully acknowledge it, but I couldn't deny it. So I basically said yes, but like didn't really go into details initially. Then we talked about it more and more, and she was supportive initially, but then after we started dating, that didn't last very long. And then so I just went back to suppressing it for like another 10 years. And at this point, we had 3 children. We had been, married, I think at that point we were married for 10 years total and together for 11 and a half. But I just finally reached a point where I'm like, look, I have to deal with this. And she just wasn't supportive at all. And I think it, caused her issues too. And she was very afraid of how people were going to see her and how she would be judged. And unfortunately, that happened with several relationships of mine where I was always honest and open up front. But then afterwards, and when everything was out publicly, they all claimed that they never knew. And I understand. I think they were afraid of being judged by their friends and stuff. Well, if you knew these things, why would you be in a relationship with that person? So they didn't want to be judged. But it was hurtful to me because I'm not perfect by any means, but I'm like, honesty is a big thing with me. And so I was always honest with them. And then when I'd find out later that they had lied to all their friends and told them that I never said anything and they didn't know, that was very hurtful. Um,
And I
but,
think
yeah.
there's a certain safety in people who have the luxury. I don't want to be disrespectful. There's a privilege in lying when it's not you that's whose life is at stake. And what I mean by that is, uh, there was a point in my life where I was either going to kill myself or something needed to change. Like, there was no in between. Like, this was the black and white. I cannot do this life anymore. And I don't know if it got that severe for you, but
It did.
at that point, everything is worth losing. Not that everything that we gained under the false mask is worth losing because we're suffocating.
Mhm.
And those are my words. I don't know how you
Yeah.
feel about it.
No, I had a very similar experience. That's when, after I got divorced, I started contemplating suicide a lot. Um, and it got to the point where Like I wouldn't take out any of my guns, and I wouldn't put myself in a situation where I would be tempted, because I was too close to wanting to do that. And I thought about it a lot, but I also, it's just not in my nature to do that. Like I think I view it too much as like giving up. And for me, so that was part of it. And but the biggest part was having three sons. Like I just couldn't do that to them. So it was something I thought about a lot and felt like it was the only solution. I definitely felt, because the thing was is like, so after I got divorced from Patty, that was the boy's mom. Um, that like I just thought no one is ever going to want to be with me. I'm going to be alone the rest of my life. I was still, I was out to like I was out to like my close friends and stuff at the time. And surprisingly, they were all very supportive. Even like people will probably be surprised to find out like all my friends from the Marines, every single one of them are very supportive of me.
Wow,
And
that is
yeah,
kudos to them.
yeah, it's, and a lot of people wouldn't think that wouldn't be the case. And the same thing with all my powerlifting friends and my jiu-jitsu friends now. Everyone's very supportive. And I'm so fortunate that I haven't lost a single friend. Family members, that's a little different, but I think a lot of it had to do with, first of all, I was open and honest about everything. And I was very vulnerable when I came out to people, and I was very honest, and I let them know like how difficult this was for me. And I think it was easy for them to see that it was real and that it was very painful and very difficult. And so I think that made it easier for people to understand. And the people knew me, and a lot of my friends respected me because of the things I had accomplished and the type of person I was. So having that respect, I think, played in a big role in it too. Some of my friends actually thought it was like a practical joke of some kind. They didn't understand why, but because like I said, I was seen as such, so uber masculine,
Yeah.
that like my one friend told me, he's like, you are the last person in the entire world that I would thought could be trans. Like you're
Which I
just
think is
so far.
makes you the best person to be speaking about these things, because you, again, there's this vision of what you were. Any of us, any of us have a danger of being authentic. And here you are, like everything had to go, not everything, you didn't lose everything, but like to be authentic and to have the people who can't handle it fall away
Yeah.
is not easy for any of us, but we all owe that to ourselves.
Yeah, 100%. Like no one, I mean, we do it when you're terrified of being open and honest. And for whatever reason that is, it could, maybe if it's related to your gender identity, your sexuality, or just other things about yourself that you're afraid of letting people know, afraid of being vulnerable. I think we all have something that we hide
Yeah.
from the world. And it's a hard thing to do. And like we're social creatures, and we want to be liked, we want to be loved, and to think that you're going to lose all of that. And at that point I was certain of it. I thought, I'm going to lose, no one's going to understand.
Yeah.
I'm going to lose all my friends, I'm going to lose my family. My boy, fortunately, one of the best decisions I ever made was to tell my sons when they were very young. And I discussed this with their mom, and she was 100% against it. And she's like, oh, it'll mess them up, this and that. And I think she was also worried again, like, if I tell them, what if they tell somebody, and then how's that
Social
going to make
risk.
her look? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then but yeah, when they were 2, 4, and 6, and it was shortly after, I don't even think the divorce was final yet. We had split and we were living in separate homes. But I told her, I said, look, I need to tell them. And she's like, oh, it's gonna, I said, no, I said, what will mess them up is sooner or later they're gonna find out. And if they don't, and if they're like, let's say it happens a decade from now and they're all teenagers, they're gonna wonder, why wasn't I honest? Why didn't I tell them? And if there's nothing to be ashamed about, why should I hide it? I just thought that was completely the wrong message to send.
Yeah.
And what am I teaching them? What kind of example am I setting, that we should be more afraid of what other people think than being true to ourselves? And I just thought that was a horrible message. And so I just, sat them down one day, and they're little, so I explained it in like what I felt were age appropriate terms. And And I just said, well, I'm going to change and I'm going to put on some makeup and change my clothes and put some hair on. And they're just kind of like, okay. And, they were young enough. They hadn't learned prejudice, right? They hadn't learned hate and they were just kind of like, okay, and then it was funny because they're all playing and I'm in my bedroom, changing and doing my makeup and stuff. And then they get all done, or I get all done, and I call them back in and they're running in and out throughout the whole thing, and just playing like little rambunctious boys do. And so I call them in and I'm like, hey guys, and I'm like, hey, and my oldest looks at me and he says, wow, you look like a girl, a really, really big girl. and
Aw.
and we all just started laughing. And then that was that. They just went back to playing. And the only questions they ever had was, are we still going to do the same things? Can we do this with you? Can we do that with you? And I'm like, of course. Like, I'm like, nothing changes. It's still me. We'll still do all the same stuff. And they were just like, okay. And that's all they cared about. And then so their whole lives, they grew up knowing, and just it was never a big deal. And even though their mom wasn't happy about it, like it of course it never caused any issues. And it actually, I think it built a lot of trust between us, and it built a special closeness. And it was funny. My middle son Garrett, um, in one of I did on my YouTube channel, it was one of we did a after the documentary, we did a little follow up with the boys. And one of the things Garrett talked about was how one of his girlfriends in high school, you know, called him one day and was like, hey, I got to talk to you. I got something super important and like this huge thing. And he's like, okay, what's up? And then she tells him that she found out. I don't remember how, but this was not too long before I was totally out. But somehow she found out that I was trans. And her assumption was Garrett didn't know. And she's like, I have this huge thing to tell you. And then so she tells him, and Garrett's like, yeah, I have known all my life. And she's like, what? And she's like, well, why didn't you tell me? He's like, because it's not a big deal. He's like,
Yeah.
yeah, he's like, that's just part of who my dad is. And
Mm.
he's like, but yeah, he's like, I'm sorry I didn't tell you, because she felt like it was this huge secret or this, really
Like it's owed
important
to
thing.
people. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. And Garrett's just like, that's totally like, he's just like, that's our lives. Like he's like, yeah, it was not a big deal to us ever. And the only time, like, yeah, like I would, take them after the divorce and stuff, like even when before I was out 100%, but I would be dolled up and taking them school shopping and things like that. And it was just like, it was just like I was their mom and doing all these things. And they never thought anything of it, because that was always, and when they were younger, I wasn't going out in public with them like that, but they always knew that. And that was just always who I was.
yeah.
And so they just never cared. And like I said, and it also built, I think, a lot of trust with us, because they knew like if I was open and honest with them about those things, I was gonna be open and honest about everything. And they knew they could trust me and I wasn't gonna judge them. And that was one of the best things I've ever done. And if there's anyone out there listening to this that has young children, I would highly recommend being open and honest with them if at a very young age.
I
It
agree.
only gets harder as they get older, and the longer you wait, the more they're going to feel a sense of betrayal, and it's going to further complicate things and make it more difficult.
And
And I
to
know
your
that's
point,
not easy in a lot of situations, especially if you have an ex who's not supportive, or there's custody issues and things like that. That can further complicates things. But I'm a big believer in honesty and openness. And like I said, for me, that was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life.
yeah, and like you said, if there is nothing to be ashamed of here, which there isn't, why
Right.
are we hiding this? Who are we protecting?
Mhm.
I do want to
Right.
talk a little bit about when you are out in public with your children and you
Mhm.
are, Janae, who you are. Have you all ever been at risk?
And not when I'm with them. I've had a couple incidents when I've been on my own. The thing is with them, when I was out, I don't think typically so when I was powerlifting and bodybuilding, especially, I mean, I was 250 pounds plus for a couple decades. And when I was bodybuilding, I got all the way up to like 280 pounds. So I was like extremely muscular. And that's at like 5'9" ish. I shrunk a little bit. I lost an inch in there somewhere. And I don't know if it's from all the years of 1,000 pound squats, being on estrogen, because you will, most people do shrink some. I think I've definitely lost a good inch, maybe an inch and a half. And but yeah, so I'm like 5'8" now. But yeah, 280 pounds at 5'9" or whatever. I was, someone who got a lot of attention everywhere I went. So then when I first started going out in public, oh my gosh, that was really difficult because I was still quite large. I wasn't quite that big, but I was extremely like muscular beyond the point of even like pro female bodybuilders. So it was like I stuck out like a sore thumb and it was really difficult. But also being that large and that muscular, it also offered me a measure of safety because people were less likely to try to, be violent with me. But there was an incident, and I did like slim down a lot, and then my body weight has gone up and down because of, wanting to fit a more feminine aesthetic or be accepted in society as a woman. And then also, but then like still being an athlete and still wanting to perform well as an athlete, there's been this tricky balance of what benefits me as an athlete versus what helps me feel more comfortable in my own skin. And so there's been a lot of back and forth. I've lost a lot of weight, put weight back on, tried to stop lifting for a short period of time where I'm still working out every day, but just changed the manner of my workouts. But yeah, when my first real attempt at transition, I lost 72 pounds. I went
Wow.
from 272 all the way down to 200. And I
Mm.
did that in like a 4.5 month period, which was not a good idea because it wasn't sustainable. I treated it like a contest diet, which was not a good thing to do. And then yeah, I got down to 200 and was miserable because I'd been, dieting so hard that I was starving all the time. It was killing my metabolism and I just felt miserable. And also like I felt like I was losing like my identity as an athlete. It was so weird for me to go from being this huge, massive, muscular person that stood out everywhere to all of a sudden now I'm presenting female in public. And when I got down around 200 pounds, I was small enough where I was able to blend in. And it was really weird to feel like invisible. Like I wasn't even
Mm.
conscious of the fact that I stood out so much until I didn't. And then all of a sudden it was very weird for me to not have people looking at me and to not be acknowledged and to
Yeah.
not, it was like everywhere I went. Yeah, when someone that muscular and that big walks in, that it was just like one of my friends, like it was to the point, one of my friends got a lot of joy out of when we would go places. He would purposely walk like 20 or 30 feet behind me, like we weren't together, just to watch everyone's reactions because I was so big that, like he said, after, of course, people would try to hide their reaction until after I passed, but
Yeah.
everyone would turn and look and point and say things. And he just got a kick out of it. He thought it was the funniest thing. And, but
So
yeah, to
there's some
go and,
comfort. There's some comfort in like this is the space I take up in the world. But when that sort of not even the persona, but when that energy is shifted and you that to me sounds vulnerable.
very much so. Yeah, it was really difficult because that was the thing too. So I went from, and at that point, I was still like in the prime of my lifting career. And so, and this is where I talk about like, and this was a really good learning experience for me. And, but I was like living like three different lives all at the same time. So Monday through Friday, I'm working as a pharmacist, in a retail store, and I'm a very average middle class, perceived as a middle class white male. And then on like at special events or like, my sponsors would send me to expos or like any type of fitness thing. And I was at a point where I was getting recognized a lot in public too, just walking around. Like I might go into Best Buy and have three people come up and ask to take a photo with me or ask for an autograph or something. But when I would go to like fitness expos or competitions, it was literally like being a movie star. Like it would take me, there was one time at the beach, and my sons got used to this when they were young, but I went to go to the bathroom and like I learned that once one person approaches you and people see you're approachable, then everybody does. And it literally took me 45 minutes just to go to the bathroom because the second one person walked up to me, and I always was, I'm a naturally social person and friendly. And so when someone would approach me and stuff like that, like I would never, like I would sometimes explain like, hey, I'm with my boys, I can't talk too long. but I would always try to be nice and cordial and stuff. But yeah, one person came over, then another person, and then I had like a crowd of people around me, and it lasted like 45 minutes. I'm like, guys, I really got to get back to my sons. I need to use the bathroom. And but they got very used to that growing up, that just everywhere we went, people would come and talk to me. And I got special treatment a lot of places. So not only did that become my identity, it was also a huge safety blanket and gave me self-worth, right? So like letting go of all that and was really difficult, because not only was it like, okay, so I'm going to give up being this, semi-famous, athlete, to like going from one end of the spectrum to the other. So on the weekends, I'm going to an expo or a competition and I'm being treated like I'm some kind of movie star. Monday through Friday, I'm just this really jacked pharmacist, but pretty much average, middle class person. But then on other weekends or other evenings, I'm starting to venture out into the world as a trans woman who does not pass, and I'm being treated less than human. So in the span of
Yes.
1 week, I can be treated like an average person, I can be treated like a star, and I can be treated like I'm the scum of the earth. And
Mhm.
when I first started going out into public, I'd hear people snickering and see them pointing, and I had this image in my head too of just like a group of high school kids seeing me and all yelling and screaming nasty things, and that never happened to that degree. I mean, I did have like going into grocery stores and things like that. That was one of my first adventures into the real world, just going grocery shopping on a Saturday afternoon, dolled up, but I was still so big, and my makeup and fashion skills were still severely lacking, and I stood out like a sore thumb. And it was like what I found was that the other people were there to do their own shopping, like hardly noticed, but the employees who really they noticed right away. And there was one kid the one time that like followed me around the store, would walk by and intentionally like loudly like laugh, and like just trying to mess with me and stuff. And but yeah, I was so terrified. I've competed in front of thousands of people. I've spoke at large conferences tons of times, and that stuff doesn't typically make me that nervous. But I was terrified the first time I went out into like a quote unquote regular place, dialed up. I remember sitting in my vehicle in the parking lot, trembling, like my whole body shaking. I was so afraid, but I was like, I need to do this. This is the next part of me being me. And it was such an experience that had mixed emotions. Like on one hand, I was elated to finally being existing in the world as myself. But on the other hand, I was, the way people reacted towards me. I remember one time walking into, again, it was like a grocery store, and the greeter at the door, like, just like her eyes bugged out and her jaw dropped as I walked in, and like my heart just fell. I'm like, oh boy, this is going to be terrible.
Here we go.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and so things like that. And I had some awkward interactions with like, just clerks at registers and stuff like that. Just it just was very, you know, filled me with anxiety, and I found I quickly learned that the more I lacked confidence and the more anxious I was, the more that other people took that same cue. Like if I didn't feel comfortable, it made them uncomfortable, and it made the whole situation really weird. And then once I got to the point where I was like, you know what, I don't care. I'm just being me. And like even when I still stood out, it just, yeah, people relaxed. And like if it's not a big deal to me, it's not a big deal to them. And I'm sure they probably talked about me after I walked away and like, holy crap, did you see that? But they didn't treat me like in that way. But
Yeah.
I did have an incident where I had five guys follow me into a parking garage one night, late at night. And it was clear to me, after it happened, that their intentions were to jump me and harm me. But I think what happened is they got close, saw how big and muscular I was, and then like it was enough to make them have second thoughts that allowed me to get to my car and get in, because I didn't even know they were there. This was the first time, like I said, growing up in an environment and being raised as a independent male. You never taught about like being vulnerable or needing to
Right.
worry about safety and things like that, and especially being a large muscular male. And so it was just something that never crossed my mind, where young girls are taught like, hey, you need to be aware of your surroundings and watch out for these things. I had never learned any of those things and never even thought about them. And then, but what happened was, um, so I was leaving a LGBT friendly club that night, and I usually went with friends and stuff. And this was kind of like, after I was really coming out, I was kind of having like my second, like almost like college era where I got to go out and have fun as a girl, and that was a really fun period for me and very
Wonderful.
fulfilling. And I've never been much of a drinker or partier, and it wasn't about that. But just going out and being in a place where I was accepted and welcomed and treated like who I was. And so that was, for a couple of years, that was a lot of fun just to be able to experience that and, get dressed up and go out and dance and have fun and stuff. And but anyway, yeah, I usually went with friends, but that night, for whatever reason, no one else could go. So I went alone. And when I was leaving, I always parked at this garage that was literally like half a block away. And this was in Ann Arbor, which for people that are familiar with Michigan, Ann Arbor is probably one of the safest areas there is.
Yeah.
And so that was like what was really another thing that was really surprising. And I think what happened is these people were leaving from a different club or different bar that was closing around, the same time. And we just happened to be in the same parking garage, but they saw me and then followed me in. And it was five guys. And I got to my car and I wasn't even aware of their presence. I closed my door and the guy's face was like right in my window, like leaning over, like mean mug at
Oh
me.
my
And
gosh.
um, and then there were four guys standing right behind him. So literally, he was probably close enough to grab me right before I got in my car. And but like I said, it was summertime. I was wearing this cute spaghetti strap dress, and but my arms and shoulders and everything were showing. And I think when they got close and they saw that I was really muscular, and were probably like I said, my guess is that it was enough to make them second guess, like, is this worth messing with this person? But
How
but
did
I
that?
just, yeah, I nonchalantly like quickly locked my doors, started my car, and backed away, keep my eyes on them. And they like kind of, walked forward and all stared me down as I pulled away. But I thought, holy cow, they could have, if they had a weapon or if they had just, jumped me from behind or, hit me with a pipe or something, like I would have had no idea. And then that was the point I realized, like, okay, I'm a target now too. I need to be much more careful about those
Yeah.
types of things.
Thank
And
you
like that,
so much for sharing that. I, Men in general don't realize that experience exists enough. However, walking through the world as a woman is very different and different. You need to have your attention differently. And so, thank you for sharing that vulnerability because, again, we don't, some of us are not socially conditioned to be aware of our surroundings, but this is the real reality that most trans persons and women and any marginalized population faces in the world today is that when we walk through the world, we have to be on alert. There is no
yeah,
option now to be, and I think you were going to say something about the body changing and how that,
yeah.
can you speak a little bit more about how that made you a little bit more vulnerable?
Yeah, it was really weird to like, so yeah, it was just like, it wasn't something I was even conscious of or thought about, but being this huge muscular person, everyone's pretty much nice to you automatically, right? Like a lot of girls like it, a lot of men respect it. And it makes it very easy to walk through the world. And don't get me wrong, it's not all benefits. Like it was kind of shocking to me, like when I was in college, that some of my professors gave me a really hard time. And I realized because they just thought I was some big dumb meathead and I didn't
Mm,
belong in those types of classes. Like my organic chemistry professor gave me a really hard time the first semester I had him, excuse me. And it was because he thought, you're some big dumb jock and you don't belong in my classes. And then when I did really well and proved myself, I had him for organic 1 and 2. And then in organic 2, we got along really well. But that whole first semester, I couldn't stand the guy. And he constantly went out of his way to make my life harder. And that happened. Like one of my other friends who was a bodybuilder and has a master's degree in physics, and we talked about how whenever he had a question for his professors or anything, he would email them or text them if that was an option, and not talk to them face to face, because
wow.
he immediately recognized that they would take him more seriously if they didn't know who he was. And if he
Yeah.
saw them face to face, they're like, oh, you're some big dumb meathead, like I don't have time for you. And so that was like one of the negative stereotypes. But for the most part, it just made life way easier. And I never even thought about like but I just started noticing after I lost a bunch of weight. And then like especially if I had a jacket on or something. I mean, I was still, even at 200 pounds, I was still pretty muscular, and especially for a woman. But if I was wearing a jacket or something that was form fitting, I looked like a slightly larger woman. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not extremely tall. I'm like 5'8". So um I didn't really draw a lot of attention, but it was weird and interesting to realize like how differently people treated me. Like before, I didn't realize that, like when I would walk into a place, everybody would get out of my way.
Yeah.
And people would just like give me preferential treatment. And I've got a number of stories of like how things happened so differently just because of who I was and how people saw me. And then existing in the world, like I said, just as an average woman is very different. And it's very different being seen as an attractive woman too. Like as my progression my transition progressed, and my body changed more. And like I said, I got better with makeup and fashion. It was very interesting having interactions with men that I could tell were attracted to me. And just how that, like, you get treated very differently. And so I feel really fortunate. Like I started to talk about like, that three where I was being treated like an average person, a superstar,
Yeah.
and then like the scum of the earth. And that was super educational for me to constantly be reminded of like how differently we exist in society. And then, but to your point, what I want to get back to and talk about is that and I experienced some of this growing up because like I said, I grew up in a small town, but my dad had a terrible reputation. We were very poor, and we were kind of seen as, by a lot of people, saw us as like a white, trashy family. And like I was the kid that a lot of parents didn't want dating their daughters. And I got, there were times in sports and stuff where I didn't get to play, or I didn't get the position that I probably should have had because I didn't come from an important family. And I had some coaches pull me aside and tell me that straight up. Like on my baseball team, like, hey, you're our best third baseman, but I can't put you there because I have another kid whose father is, involved in the school and he has to play, and things like that. And coaches apologizing to me like, hey, you should have got more honors, but I can't push for all the kids. And just, they knew that no one from my family was going to complain, or, so stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I knew what it was like to be marginalized in that way. But then as I got older and got more accomplished, obviously it was totally different. But I always kind of had a chip on my shoulder about between knowing I was trans and then growing up that way. I always had a chip on my shoulder about being treated like I was less. And so that was something that drove a lot of what I did, and was always a motivation for me to prove people wrong and to prove to
Yeah.
them that I wasn't less. And so that's part of what drove me to win and be successful. And I use that for motivation. And but uh but it was a lot to give up to, and a lot to sacrifice. And then like existing in the world, this is kind of what I think is important to get to. So I went from being, a middle class, perceived as a middle class white male, and we don't think of things like being discriminated against, or like something simple like being pulled over by the police. And it was funny, I
Yeah.
just had a discussion the other day with one of my jujitsu friends, and he's Brazilian but very dark skinned. And it's one of our teammates asked him if he'd ever been discriminated against for his race. And he busted out laughing. He's like, "Is that a serious question?" He's like,
Yes.
"Of course I have." He's like, all the time. And but this person was very naive, and they grew up in a, kind of a more privileged background, and just had obviously had never experienced any of that themselves, but hadn't even really seen other people experiencing it. It wasn't, didn't really believe that it's as prevalent as it is. And then he kind of looked at me, and then and they asked about me as well. And I'm like, yeah, like, being trans, especially not being passable, stuff happens all the time. But it was really educational for me, like having been someone that never, if I got pulled over by the police, I was just worried about getting a ticket or whatever. I wasn't worried about violence or
Yes.
things like that. And now, like, and then existing, especially, like, so I've been able to change my birth certificate and all my identification, and so everything says female. And but I don't always, like, depending. So unfortunately, this is a wig I'm wearing because my hair thinned, and I can't grow my own hair out, which is really one of the things that is very distressing for me. I really wish I could. I mean, sometimes wigs are nice. I can change my hairstyle at the drop of a hat
Yeah.
and things like that. But at the same time, for me, it makes it feel like a costume and it makes it feel like it's
Mhm.
not part of me. And so, like taking my hair off at the end of the day, and honestly, wigs are hot and itchy, and especially in the summertime. And with my lifestyle, being in the gym all the time, I love to mountain bike, and then I practice jujitsu almost every day. Well, I can't wear a wig at jujitsu. So it's like one of those things. I walk in there, often looking like this, but then I take the hair off and stuff when I practice. And the thing is, if I'm not wearing makeup and if I don't have a wig on that day, because my head's shaved and I don't feel like wearing a wig every day, so I don't.
Right.
And I often still get read as male, but not always. It's starting, I think, with the hormones and stuff are changing enough where I'm starting to still get read as female, even when I have no makeup and no hair on. And I think the way I dress and stuff too, like majority of like I wear a lot of athletic clothes, but I'll wear tights or joggers, and I have a lot of like form-fitting zip-up hoodies and things like that. But it's starting to get to the point, which is always really nice, when I think I'm being read as male and then realize I'm being read as female, and that's always a really nice thing. But yeah, but it was a very interesting thing and educational to, yeah, being very worried when I got pulled over. And like, especially like if I felt like I didn't match my ID, like my passport
Yeah.
had, and I'm actually getting that updated right now. Because that was the last thing I had, that even though my name, because I legally changed my name, I believe in 2014. And that was like a long, hard process. I think it's gotten a little better since then, but I got that done in like 2014 or 2015, and then was able to legally change my gender because some of the surgical procedures I've had. Every state, for people don't realize, like every state's different about rules for changing your
Yes.
gender on your birth certificate. Some states it's very easy. You can simply just do it, and other states you can never do it. Like I had a friend who was born in Tennessee, and she's fully transitioned, had all the surgeries, has existed in society as a woman. Like most people around here have no idea she's trans, and she could never change her birth certificate though. And then you basically need your birth certificate to change all your other IDs. In some
Right.
places, you're able to change your driver's license. And actually, I think it was her. I think it was her that told me this. She was actually able to change her driver's license. And it wasn't her; it was another trans friend of mine. But they could never change their birth certificate, but because they were integrated in society as a woman and seen as a woman by everybody, like no one would look at this person and think they're anything but a woman. And she just went to the either Secretary of State here or DMV or whatever state her driver's license was in, and she just said like she thought it was worth a try, so she went in there and she just took her driver's license. She said, hey, there's a mistake on here, they messed up my gender. And the lady didn't even question it right away. She's like, oh my god, honey, let me fix that for you. and um
Oh, I wish it was
and
that easy everywhere.
yeah. So she went in, and then the woman didn't even question her, didn't ask for anything. She's like, oh yeah, like let me fix that. And then updated her driver's license, changed it to female. And so she was able to update that. But like I said, in some places it's easy to change, and in some places it's
Yeah.
impossible to. And then that puts you at danger and at risk anytime you're forced to produce that. It outs
100%.
you, and it can make it, potentially, expose you to violence. But yeah, for
Yeah.
me, like it went to when I got pulled over, then I was in a especially once I changed, well, before my ID was changed and I was presenting feminine and I still had a male ID, then I was scared like, oh shit, like I'm being outed, and how am I going to be treated and all those things. And people like, and some people just tend to think like that's all made up or it doesn't really happen. Like no, it's a real thing and it happens very, very frequently. And
Yes.
there was, and people could look this up, but there was an incident, and this is quite a while ago. I want to say it's over a decade ago, but it was an incident where a trans woman was in a car wreck, was unconscious and bleeding badly. And when the EMT showed up, they started working on her, and she would have been fine, but they were cutting her clothes off, and she hadn't had bottom surgery yet, and they discovered she was trans. Not only did they, stop working on her, they like mocked her, like started like she's unconscious, bleeding to death on the side of the
Yeah.
road, and they stood there and mocked her. And the only reason anyone ever found out was because some bystanders saw this and reported it. And then they found out later that not only did they not treat her at the scene, when they did finally take her to the hospital, instead of, if she was losing a lot of blood, so she needed a blood transfusion. Instead of taking her and giving her a blood transfusion, they stuck her in, they went to the hospital, stuck her in another room and just left her there, and she died. And then eventually this all came out in court later, but things like that happen. But I
Yeah.
can't imagine anyone, regardless of who they are, just allowing someone to die because, because of who they are, like that. But that kind of stuff happens. And
And
I, yeah.
I want to pause there and just,
Mhm.
not only are 1 in 5 trans persons at risk of suicide, but then we have, like to your point, trans persons at risk of violence in culture, and then by state sanctioned culture, police, psychiatric, medical care, all of those things. Now we include the people who are at most risk, which is the trans African American women
Yeah.
who who are in the streets performing, sex services for people behind closed doors. But on top of all of that violence, on top of all of that horrific things that can happen, when somebody dies, sometimes we don't even know who they were because they've been dead named.
Yeah.
They've been given, they've been not identified as trans. So we really don't even have the statistics on this, which is why I am so grateful that you speak on these things. And I don't really want to end on a negative note, because I definitely want to get into the sports and athletes and all of these things. But the things that you have shared today are so human, and I am so grateful that you have shared these things. Is there anything that in this episode you would like us to know further about? You have just been so educational, and I hope this is, I hope so many people hear this. You're so transparent. I want you, I want to interview you again, and I want you to share more of this, because this is what people don't know. And these are the myths and the denials that I don't want us to continue to have. There was a Senate hearing the other day about how gender affirming care, birth control, affected more than women. And the woman said, we can't deny that men are at risk of giving birth as well. And to deny that is transphobic. And the point of all of this is that you have a beautiful story full of beauty and tragedy. You and I are so much more alike than there are differences. I don't weightlift, but we are very much alike in a lot of ways. Like I power lift, sorry. The risk that you took to come out, to be your authentic self, opened a door for you to show other people a lot of different things that you wouldn't have been able to show them had you stayed in the body and personhood that you were.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, honestly, and that's what's made like everything like this is, we can talk about this in another episode, but this is, me coming out hurt me substantially financially and in a lot
Okay.
of other ways. Like I said, like half my family doesn't talk to me. It strained my relationship with my parents for quite a while. There was a period, my mom doesn't like to admit this, but there's about a 5-year period where I wasn't invited to any of the family holidays. And, she would never acknowledge that. She would just, like, when I would ask, like, hey, when's Christmas or whatever? Oh, I don't know if I'm going to do it. I don't know. And then just would never tell me. And then would kind of deny it, because I think as a mom, she felt horrible doing that, but still did it because she was worried about what people would think. And, I was, things like being uninvited to weddings and stuff like
Yeah.
that, when they were afraid that, oh, she's going to show up all dolled up and be the center of attention. And I'm like, I don't know what you think. Like, I'm not going to make this grand entrance, and I'm
And
just
you
going
were
to show
okay
up
with
like
me being
everyone
the
else.
center of attention when I was looking
Yeah.
this way.
Yeah. Yeah. And, but yeah, it's been, there's definitely been a large cost, but I have zero regrets. Like, like most trans people will tell you, like, my only real regret is not doing it sooner. And it was, and for me, a lot of it with the delayed it was me competing as a professional athlete, and it shortened my career. Like, I would have probably had more success and longer success had I not been trans, because I still was in the prime of my career when I started to transition. And that was kind of a back and forth process for a while. But yeah, it's all worth it. And when I, like, and I've gotten a lot of messages from people thanking me for being out and open and changing their minds. And it still happens. I mean, I've been, completely out, and we haven't even talked about like how well, like I came out to people close to me, but I was outed publicly by someone else, and that was a whole nother thing. And that's what the documentary focuses a lot on, is the 2 years after I was outed and how that affected my life. And but anytime I receive a message from someone, especially like a parent or a child, telling me that my story helped them understand or help someone not commit suicide, that, I mean, that makes it all worthwhile. Like,
Yeah,
if,
that's and to your point, when you were a child, this wasn't available in terms of information. And to be that person, I'm going to get emotional. I needed this person when I was a child. I needed somebody like you. And there are so many children out there right now who are being threatened ridiculously for no reason. And I'm really grateful that you do this. I want your book when you write
yeah.
it. And I also would love to have you back and talk about this very, very important topic of authenticity and the costs and benefits and your upcoming podcast and anything you want to talk about. Would you, I would love to have you back. Would you be
Oh,
open to that?
absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to be on again, and as many times as you want to have me.
I would
But
love
yeah,
that.
but yeah, and I'm
Wonderful.
excited. Yeah, excited about that. And like I said, I just think one of our biggest problems too in the trans community is that so many of us are invisible.
Yeah.
The people that, you only hear about like the extremes, and this is something else we can talk about next time too, but just, like how political propaganda and how, like, my friend that I'm doing the podcast with, like, the way algorithms work and everything, and she tends to get a lot more conservative based.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like we're going to talk about this in one of our episodes, but like how, if you look at our social media relating to the same topics, the stuff I get and the stuff she gets is very, very different. And it's like, the stuff she gets, like so much stuff that is extremely transphobic, and it's just like that's all she sees. So you like, people who only see that's what they think the trans community is, and
Yeah.
all they're seeing is like this extreme of it, and a lot of it I question if these people are even real.
Yep.
I think a lot of it is staged, and there was one person recently, said, I don't want to draw this out too much longer, but there was a person recently that they were someone who had, or like a minor celebrity, they were on some show, and then they all of a sudden they claimed to be trans. And it was just very clear to me, like some other people forwarded it to me and said, is this person legit? Like, but they were just like kind of playing out all the tropes and stereotypes. And I just like watched some of their posts and stuff, and I'm like, I don't think this person's trans at all. I think this is a publicity stunt, and they're doing it for views. And they did this for several months, maybe a little bit longer, and then they acknowledged that this was like a stunt of some kind, and they were, trying to expose how gullible the libs are and all this stuff. And just personally, I don't identify with any political party. I think that there's a lot of problems throughout politics. So I'm not someone, and my views kind of, it depends on the topic. Like socially, I'm obviously I would, have very liberal, what we consider very liberal views, fiscally more conservative. I'm a former Marine and all these things, but I don't identify, like people think, I must be some super liberal because I'm trans. And that's not the case. I think it's more complicated than that. I don't think a two-party
Yeah.
system accurately, represents, our nation as a whole. Um, anyway, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
But just how differently, like I said, what my friend, all the stuff she gets versus what I get in my algorithm, in my feed, it's just night and day. And there's so much propaganda, there's so much misinformation, disinformation. And that's why I think it's important to be open and honest, and why I am, I feel a responsibility to do
Yeah.
that. And I think too, the sad part is like I said, so much of our community is completely invisible. Like I have a handful of friends who no one knows they're trans because of the threat of violence and discrimination,
Yeah.
especially for trans women. It's not safe to be out. And so they, a lot of times they move, start their lives over,
Yep.
and no one around them, or maybe a couple of their closest friends or something, are the only people that know they're trans. And so here they exist every day. They have tons of friends, and
Would you have
people
this
like,
life in the
yeah,
place you grew up in?
oh, that would be, it would be extremely difficult. I mean, I go home every now and then, and several times a year. Um, it would be, it would definitely be a lot. I mean, it's difficult even at times where I'm at. Like, I know, like, my business, my gym would be more popular and I'd have more members if I wasn't trans. Like, that's not
Yeah.
even, there's not even a question. Like, there are definitely people who don't go there because of that. And I've lost a lot of opportunities in the lifting world and strength community. Like, it's arguable that when I was at the prime of my career, I was one of the most popular, if not like the most popular power lifter in the sport. And then, yeah, as soon as I was outed publicly, like, I had been speaking at lots of seminars. I was, invited to a lot of things. I was writing for multiple websites. I was a assistant, like for one of the biggest magazines at the time. I was on their staff as like considered like a strength expert, and I would be consulted for articles on lots of things. Yeah, I was on the cover of two different magazines. When I got outed, all that stopped. There
Mm,
was like an initial, like, a couple articles and stuff all about me being trans and coming outed because everybody wanted to report about that. And then once that was over with, like, there's been zero interest.
crickets.
So I
Yeah.
went from being like this expert in this field to someone who had zero opportunity. And there's been other business opportunities that, like, there was one recently, a friend as a pharmacist role, one of my friends is starting up this company that has to do with like hormone replacement and stuff like that. And he wanted to bring me on as like their main pharmacist to oversee everything. His business partners absolutely refused because I'm
Ah,
trans.
yeah.
And he was like furious, but there's four people involved and they just said no. Their excuse was that they were worried that it would hurt business if people found out. And
Yeah.
they absolutely refused to have me on. And they didn't make any qualms about it. It was solely because I'm trans. It wasn't that they didn't feel I was knowledgeable enough or would do a good
Right.
job. And actually, I'm much more educated on this topic than the person they're going to go with.
Yeah.
And but yeah, just no, that person's trans. We don't want to be associated with them at all. And but anyway, yeah, my whole point was about how it's so important to be visible, just being
Yeah.
visible, and having people see that no, trans people, we're not a bunch of lunatics. And we're like, I tell people, we're trans people are like everybody else. Some of us are amazing, awesome people, kind and loving, and some of us are absolute jerks. And it's just, it's we're every demographic, just like every other, subculture. And
But what you are not is inhuman. And you
yeah,
are like, you're nothing to be afraid of any more
yeah,
than what we will talk about next time, which is the church and all the other people that we really do need to be focusing on. But I want to follow up next episode on how you rebuilt your life when everything sort of like fell away. And I've made some notes about things I want to talk about again. So I'm going to pause the episode here and then we'll talk offline in a second. But again, I just want to thank you. I've been looking forward to this podcast for months and you are not so far from me. So we will continue this conversation. I hope this was helpful to the audience. And if anybody wants, I will put the link to Janae's information in the notes, and also check out the documentary Transformer. And I will keep you posted on her podcast. Have a good day, everybody.